always fun. All right, so our recording has started. If you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat box. Lauren, my colleague, Lauren Cordova, and myself will be following the chat box. And then after Gwen's presentation, we will have an opportunity for you to open up your mic and ask some questions directly and a little bit of dialogue. If there, we are asking that you hold any dialogue questions till after the presentation, but please feel free to raise your hand or put in the chat if you need a clarification question, if there's something that you don't understand, so that we can get that understanding as we move through the presentation. Other than that, I don't want to pause us any longer, and without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker for today. Gwen Bridge is joining us from Canada, and very excited to have Gwen joining us today. Gwen works with, or she is the primary for Gwen Bridge Consulting, and we actually started working with Gwen. We were introduced by James Rattling-Leaf based on work that they're doing together in incorporating Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge into decision-making for environmental work. And really thankful to James for introducing us, and so grateful for Gwen for joining us today. So I will let Gwen introduce herself, and I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Stephanie. Tansei, my name is Gwen Bridge. Thank you, Stephanie, for inviting me. Thank you, Udall Foundation. Thank you all for being here to listen to this presentation. Thanks also to James, who's been an instrumental colleague in building this body of work across the continent, really, both in Canada and the United States. So exciting to be here. Thanks all for taking the time. It's so gratifying, and I'm so grateful that you do find enough interest in this and to spend your time with me here today. I'm Cree from Satellite Cree Nation in Alberta, and my mom is from there. My dad's actually from England, and I live now in the Okanagan Territory here in British Columbia, Canada, in this small town called Penticton. So, and I've been working in BC as a consultant. I work in BC, Alberta, well, across Canada and the United States, but been a consultant since 2010. And what I'll share with you today is really a lot of the culmination of thinking over the past 20 years of my work with tribes and with governments to really think through the advancements, I really feel are needed in achieving or advancing towards this concept of reconciliation between two worldviews or two-idea and all of this kind of stuff. So I've prepared this shortest presentation. This presentation, there's a lot of information and I speak quickly. And so as Stephanie said, if there are questions that you'd like answered that will help in your clarity through the presentation, please do that. And we'll have a time for talking after. I'll speak quickly because there's a lot of information and this is one of the shorter presentations that I'll give. So yeah, it'd be cool to see in the chat where you're coming from and whatnot. And so with that, I think I'll start sharing my screen now and run through this presentation. So I can't see you. So as I mentioned, do make yourselves aware, and Lauren can take a look at those questions. So this is a presentation that's entitled Ethical Space, which is a framework that I've really found useful in providing the context for the conversations that I've been having for this past 20 years and that I believe we need to have more of, and so do you, so that we can really create this better world that we're wanting to do. So this is it's in ethical space, understanding the roots of conflict, Indigenous law, and science. And this is when we get to the dialogue part, it's really a dialogue, like I'm learning too. And so your guys' experience and thoughts and ideas are critical to the building this, I guess, community of practice type work that you guys do. So I'll go through this sort of how I view what we need to know in order to really facilitate these conversations. I'll talk about the examples, some of the examples in my work, which we're doing this, how things have been, some best practices from that point of view, for sure. And so this is, I think that we as Indigenous and non-Indigenous people really reflect on why we want to have these conversations. Why are you here? Why do we want these better relationships, right? I find I've sort of distilled these into three imperatives, really. We have the moral imperative, right? We really want to make a better world for each other. We really want to resolve this inequality and segregation here in Canada in particular. So these types of questions are really this moral imperative. There's the legal imperative, this United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, US signed in 2010, Canada finally endorsed in 2016, and then recently, this past year, did a Bill C-15, it's called, which is really a commitment to make all Canadian legislation consistent with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP. British Columbia, the jurisdiction which I currently reside, has also done the same. They call it a Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, so DRIPA. So if I use UNDRIP and DRIPA, those are those types of things. So I might slide into acronyms. So these are called the sort of legal imperative, really, and I find that's one of the biggest motivations for a lot of the new enthusiasm of governments to engage with Indigenous people. Are motivated by this legal imperative. And then, of course, we have the environmental imperative. I was in Marseille last year in September, and at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and really what came out of there was these very clear statements that Indigenous people's lands are managed more effectively by Indigenous people than by anybody else, including those areas which are in national parks, but non-Indigenous jurisdictions. So we have things like 80% of the world's biodiversity remaining on Indigenous managed lands in the world. So the message there, from eloquently restated by many, many people, is that in order for us to have whatever kind of solution, nature-based solution, James calls it Indigenous-based solutions, which I really like, is that really within the knowledge and the application of Indigenous methodologies on land is the salvation of the earth, right? So that was a clear and dramatic message. And of course, it gets carried on to these other initiatives. And there's lots of this initiative now to really center Indigenous leadership in the achievement of 30 by 30, both for the America the Beautiful and Canada's 30 by 30 objectives, as well as this new movement, I don't know if it's new, but recently burgeoning in terms of the centering of Indigenous leadership within the Nature Needs Half movement as well. So we have these three imperatives, right? And how do we begin to what do we need to know to be able to do this work, right? We need to be grounded in UNDRIP principles. I review them frequently. Reconciliation, and I'll talk a lot about that today as a concept, and really that's the foundational consideration of my talk, is how do we understand when we talk about reconciliation, what exactly are we trying to reconcile? There's a lot of different viewpoints on that, and I'll think through that. And one of these is, of course, the structural characteristics of the worldviews. We need to understand that, so I'll talk about that. There's ongoing challenges, of course, in the application of our understanding, and as we're collectively opening our minds, if you will, to broader understandings of the world and the application of different legislative frameworks based on belief systems, then we need to acknowledge that these challenges are real between us. So, and then what happens when we know these things? We really have to practice this open-mindedness and creativity, right? Ethical space is, I'll share with you from my learnings of it, is really about a creative space. We get to create something new once we have these deeper understandings to be able to create a better future for us all, which is really essentially the rhetoric of a lot of the scientific movement today, particularly around climate change and stuff. So UNDRIP, you guys are probably pretty well aware of this. I just mentioned this, the legislative frameworks that are becoming established in Canada. We know, of course, that Biden did his ITEK memo in November of last year, which really said that the federal agencies need to be consistent or apply Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge within all of their policy work and their work in general. So, there was a little, the comments that the White House is receiving about how to do that in terms of those policy initiatives is important to be involved with. So this continental momentum towards reconciliation and the application of Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge is really important and exciting, but we sort of have to think, well, what is traditional ecological knowledge, and what are exactly we trying to reconcile and apply when we think about these types of management, natural resource management mechanisms? This is just a shorthand for UNDRIP, which I find useful. Basically, when you read it, it says that it obligates the nation states to acknowledge and recognize Indigenous rights, protect those rights, and then pay to protect, redress, or mitigate impacts to those rights. So for me, this notion of the economic component of this commitment to DRIP or to UNDRIP is really critical. And we won't get into it a lot here today, except to say that it's a burgeoning area of my personal and professional interest, but certainly how we begin to frame conservation economies or sustainable economies based on Indigenous economic priorities, values, and methodologies, including contemporary, modern, as well as the sustainability of the earth. And I think in Canada, in particular, in the continent of the continent of North America, for sure, there's a lack of really thinking through what those sustainable and Indigenous-based economies look like. So when we're talking about conservation and the application of Indigenous knowledge, the economic component will really play a key role in how we're able to achieve those goals. And it's something that is, I think, not often discussed, and really important for First Nations to be able to bring forward the kind of economic rationale that would support their objectives. Currently, some of the discourse in Canada in particular is like, well, we're not able to conserve or implement your Indigenous methodology because of the economic impacts. There'll be 600 jobs impacted. And First Nations, what we call sort of tribes in Canada, have been saying, well, we don't really agree with that. We think there must be a better way, but they haven't been provided the resources or the expertise to be able to articulate that other way with an economic rationale. There is some work internationally happening, called a Large Landscape Finance Lab. I think it's called Landscapes Finance Lab, if you Google that, really looking at the sustainability and business mechanisms and Indigenous mechanisms to support large landscape level conservation, like 1 million hectares plus, and building these robust economies based really on financing ecologically and sustainable minded businesses. Anyways, that's a little aside, but I think that when we're doing our work and we're thinking about the applications and implications of traditional ecological knowledge being applied on the landscape, it's really critical not to forget about the economic components. However, in this particular short talk, there's a lot to talk about in all of this stuff, and we spend our lives working through these questions. And so I'll present just these short bits here. But this Article 27 is really important. And if this talk were centered around, say, how to think through strategies to support a particular article of UNDRIP, this would be the article. So Article 27 says, Indigenous people have the right to establish these systems whereby their laws, traditions, customs, and land tenure systems are recognized, and that the systems whereby those Indigenous rights can be adjudicated, right? So what this means, and what's happening in Canada in particular, but likely elsewhere, is that nations, Indigenous nations, are beginning to articulate and codify their own law based on story, based on their protocols, based on their traditional knowledge, into documents which can be then well understood by non-Indigenous peoples, right? So you have, they're called law books here in Canada, and we have, say, water laws or natural resource laws that come out of the story, an exercise of really distilling the legal principles and the actual laws that are derived from those stories, or that guide the behavior of the participants of that society, which is law. Really getting clear on what those are. Indigenous people are like, we don't need to codify those. We understand it through our oral and traditional systems, but it's for these others who need to understand those kinds of what those particular laws are. And then following the codification of the law is then the need to have the adjudication mechanisms, the sort of Indigenous and traditional adjudication mechanisms built so that you can say where and when Indigenous law is being violated, right? So that's a area that's building, but it's less built than those really. So you have sort of this core, which is this articulation of Indigenous law. Then you have the development of the adjudication mechanisms. And then of course you would have the penalties or consequences for violation of Indigenous law. So throughout Canada and likely North America, we'll begin to see these kinds of legal systems being not developed because they already exist, but being effectively communicated to the other. What the DRIPA action plan in British Columbia talks a lot about is this notion of legal pluralism. So how do we begin to explore the concepts of legal pluralism with the Western system, in Canada, sort of the Canadian system, and the Indigenous system? What does legal pluralism really mean when we begin to think around that? It's really critical in thinking about reconciliation, that this notion of legal pluralism that's confirmed in UNDRIP, like Indigenous people have the right to apply their own laws and that kind of stuff, is the exercise, I think, right? And I'll talk a little bit about that more in a moment. But here I just want to say science is oftentimes in our work in natural resources or ecology, we think about science, and I have a master's of science. I forgot in my introduction, the science and yeah, anyway. So these concepts of science, this is just to say that Indigenous science, and I'll explain more, this concept is so much more than the application of a certain methodology for understanding Earth, right? It's that, plus it's the conclusions that are drawn from those observations manifested in law, right? So the science on the Western side says, well, we have science, we observe the Earth, we conclude, make conclusions and recommendations about what the Earth is saying, if you will. But then that's kind of the limits of science, our concepts of science. In Indigenous societies, typically science is all of that, plus it's also the understanding that what the Earth's conclusions are, as interpreted by scientists or traditional storytellers, or in the case of the Okanagan, there's people who speak with the Earth. And so their conclusions directly inform the behavior or put constraints on the behavior of participants in society. So I'll talk about that. But this is just to know, when we talk about science, we broaden our understanding on our perspectives when we're thinking about Indigenous ecological knowledge. So reconciliation, I'll talk a little bit about this as a concept. And now that Deb Haaland has really initiated in the States a similar process for you guys in terms of moving through an understanding of the reconciliation needed because of the residential schools, it's going to become more important in your lexicon. It's a really big buzzword here in Canada. We're going to reconcile with Indigenous people. It came out, of course, this Truth and Reconciliation Commission of 2015 modeled on the reconciliation process of South Africa. And there was a process of beginning to understand the truth of what happened in residential schools and then what we should do about it. They came up with these 94 calls to action. And there's many good ones. They're about, health equity and cultural survival and language revitalization and social and educational services, all of these kinds of things. But one of the most fundamental premises of the recognition that what's required to achieve all of these 94 calls to action is that the first relationship that must heal is the relationship of the Indigenous people to their land. So this is a fundamental premise upon which all of these other 94 calls to action are predicated, right? You won't be able to achieve reconciliation across these 94 areas if the relationship of Indigenous people to their land is not healed. So they recognize this commission in 2015. I think it's a really important point because oftentimes when we think about reconciliation, we think about situations, topics or spatial areas about which there is a question. Should we do something on this land or should we not? We engage in these conversations around reconciling that decision and coming up with a joint decision, and we call that reconciliation, and it may or it may not be for sure. But the question in reconciliation, all of this separate work, though, one of the fundamental criteria, I suppose, if we're going to be people who advance reconciliation is the work that we're doing supporting the healing of Indigenous people's relationship with their land, right? And you may have heard yesterday, the Pope in Canada at Ermineskin Cree Nation in Alberta apologized. Well, the quote in our news was begged forgiveness for the experience of the residential school, right? And so this was a particular call to action. This number 47 was, we call upon federal, provincial, and municipal governments to repudiate concepts used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous peoples in their land, such as the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, and to reform those laws, government policies, and litigation strategies that continue to rely on such concepts. So basically what that says, and what we'll talk about in this conversation, is that the premises of all of the colonial societies within North America is that they were built upon these understandings of a Christian notion of humanity, land ownership, domination, all of these kinds of things, and that to have reconciliation, we have to explore and repudiate all of those concepts, right? And I'll talk about why that's so important in our society, even though we may view ourselves as far removed from the papal bulls of the 1400s and secular societies, if you will, particularly in Canada, less so in the States, you view yourselves as secular, but certainly in Canada we do. So that's Good. I invite you to take a look at those calls to action. If you're not familiar with them, you'll see probably similar types of things coming out of your own reconciliation process around residential schools in the States. So the big question here in Canada and for everyone is, well, what is reconciliation? What does it mean, right? If we're in person, I ask, someone tell me what reconciliation means. Right? There's no one definition. And there's a lot of different perspectives, even within some of my Indigenous colleagues. They're like, reconciliation is a failure, right? Because there's still dissatisfactory conversations which are guided by a misunderstanding of what reconciliation is, and I'll speak more to that as we go along. But when we're thinking about reconciliation, I really enjoy the metaphor of two-eyed seeing, because it provides a visceral and tangible metaphor for what we're trying to do, right? And so if you go in with one eye and you just see with one eye, you focus on a vision, a trajectory, a focal point, and you walk towards that, you'll get there for sure, right? But when you open the other eye, your target shifts. And so you'll never get there, right? And so in order to get there, you have to, from the outset, establish this vision, which is using both eyes, right? Because if you don't, then you're not going to achieve, you either won't have a target and focus, or you'll be working towards a target which is not reconciled with the other point or worldview, right? So I really like that metaphor. And then, what happens when we see out of those two eyes, right? There's something sort of magic in the brain which happens, this alchemy, which performs this reconciliation of those two independent and unique inputs. And so I really like this metaphor of ethical space, which was provided by Dr. Reg Crowshoe in his document, Voices of Understanding, which is published by the Alberta Energy Regulator in Alberta. A great document if you want to Google that. It explains clearly and eloquently this concept of ethical space, which I'll share with you how I've thought through it and used it in my work now. But anyways, take a look at that document. It's great. So he says, well, when we're looking from each eyes, what we're trying to do is do this ethical space, which is taking what's most important from each culture, what's critical to be understood at a very deep level about each of the cultures, bring them into this ethical space and create something new. So his call was that we do have to get creative in this space. And also we do have to bring forward this deep understanding of what's important to be understood by the other. And I think this is really important, and particularly in the States where the Black Lives Matter movement was so important and critical. And there was a little bit of talk I heard, and I'm no expert for sure, but some of the things like, well, we don't, as Black people, have the obligation to teach you all of our history and to share with you all of these stories over and over again, because that information is available. In Canada, that information is not available. The dearth of history that was provided in schools, the subjugation and racist approach to Indigenous people precluded the ability for non-Indigenous people to understand pretty much anything about Indigenous cultures. So the work we have now, and Reg says the onus is on Indigenous people to bring forward what's important to be understood about the Indigenous system so that we can have this ethical space. I think it's often pretty well understood by those of you in negotiations and Indigenous people in those negotiations about what's coming in from the Western side, right? So even Indigenous people have a really solid understanding because of the imposition of residential schools, in Canada in particular, the indoctrination of Western systems in the regular school system, and the imposition of the Indian Act, for example, the imposition of democracy within tribal nations, right? So that's pretty well understood, things like the roles of leaderships and politicians, this notion of democracy and democratic governance, and how do you build constitutions based on those kinds of things. The notion of science, which I mentioned, some of those differentiating points earlier, religion, sets of values, this concept of patriarchy, the Age of Enlightenment, or the moment where we began to, as a Western society, think through a new way of understanding the earth and really getting focused on drilling down and that kind of stuff. Good things and interesting things, and those are important to be understood by all as we go forward in these conversations. What's less well understood, I think, is what's important to come in from the Indigenous space. So it includes things like traditional ecological knowledge, or you're calling it now in the States, ITEK, the stories, the protocols and prescriptions derived from those stories, the understanding of leadership, what to chiefs mean, different sets of values, Indigenous governance, certainly not all were democracies, probably most even weren't democracies, the role of spirituality as a real input into decision-making. How do you access the inputs from the spiritual realm, and then how do you apply those inputs in land and resource decision making? Not very well understood by the non-Indigenous, for sure. The role of community in decision making and actual land management, how we go about our lives in Indigenous communities, looks a lot different than in the Western society. So how do we understand those components? Reg says this needs to all get done in this environment of cultural safety. Cultural safety, you guys are probably know more about it than me, for sure, being practitioners in conflict resolution. But he says is just, to be able to apply the cultural protocols which are associated with the process of decision making and coming to agreement within that particular community. So he talks about the order you sit in the teepee. We know from the longhouse cultures that you have different places where you sit in the longhouse and according with your role in the political process, those kinds of things. So just being really mindful of the culturally specific processes of coming to agreement that are happening in that culture, and knowing how to ask and apply those kinds of things is this concept of cultural safety. So when we talked about what's important to be put into the ethical space by the Indigenous people, what's important to be understood, this concept, which I'll share with you now, is essentially my offering into the space, if you will, based on my experience, my identity, my relationships. And so it's like, well, what is important to be understood? And so I was with some colleagues, notably Rob Edward of the Lower Similkameen, thinking through this concept of reconciliation in relation to the experiences we were continuing to have, which were meant to be conversations which resulted in resolution to particular topics. And so, for example, it's like, well, should we cut, a forest company comes or the government comes, should we cut down these trees that are in the forest for timber? And the First Nation says, well, actually, we'd like to continue to pick our traditional medicines in that area. So you had this conversation about, well, should we cut or should we save medicines and all this kind of stuff. So sometimes you might have a resolution to this topic. And I use this example from the Osirius Indian Band. It's been a decade or so. This one lady, we were talking about the impact of the housing development, right? And she said, no, it's okay. I just go and I just ask those people who live there now if I can walk through their yard to my next berry pick, to the other berry picking area. So they destroyed one, but she felt she could still go and access her berries. So the question we had, well, is that reconciliation? Like, really? She seemed to be okay with it. The developers were okay with it. Is that reconciliation? And we're like, well, those still feel really dissatisfactory questions, because you may or may not have reconciliation based on a topic or a spatial question such as that. But what happens is that question keeps getting deferred to the next area, to the next area, to the next area, right? So you're having the same conversation over and over and over again across the landscape. And when you look at the landscape as a whole, you end up seeing a fragmented landscape, and the First Nations are frustrated with that. So, okay, if those conversations are not satisfactory, what are we really trying, what conversations do we need to have? And so this is essentially the answer to that question, right, when we thought about it for quite some time. And I think usually the best way for me to do it is just to start explaining what our thought process was when we were thinking through this exercise. And so I just test my pen there. Yeah, okay. So when we were in those meetings and people were like, well, we think we should cut down the trees, but we want to hear what your values and your interests are, right? It's like, well, where does the person, how does a person come to a meeting like that, believing that they have the authority to discuss a question like that and to ultimately make a decision about that question, right? That they somehow, this human person, this entity, this government has the authority to determine the outcome of this system, right? Where does that belief come from? Where does that sort of inherent perspective of that authority to do that question, where does that come from? And so we began to think through some of the most fundamental differences between the two worldviews, right? And so, I'll just get into the explanation here now. So we have essentially human societies typically around the world explain their origins through this idea of a God or a creator, right? And so those things are pretty similar, right? Like deriving from this metaphysical ether are these concepts both in Indigenous and non-Indigenous societies of a creator. So, okay, so the creator exists and does all its good thing, creating the everything, the plants, the animals, the water, the air, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah, that's true. And I use the Okanagan Nation here as an example. And I'll get into some of how this plays out in the actual agreements making, how this understanding is informing the work that we're doing in negotiating conservation and natural resource management agreements. So we have on the God side, Western God, right? This idea that God has delegated the authority to a human entity, to a human group, to a human individual, to make the decisions about what happens to the animals and the water and the earth. So, I started reading the Bible because I'm doing this work and I want to check my assumptions. So indeed, as far as I've gotten so far, it's been reinforced throughout that this God has delegated the authority to the human entity to make the decisions about basically the fates of the entities themselves and the fates of the humans themselves, right? So God said, well, you go, and essentially this concept of dominion, you go and have dominion over the earth. You get to determine the fate of these other things, use them for food, and hopefully all be happy and healthy and all this kind of stuff, right? So God comes in and says, okay, you humans, you get to determine the fate of the systems. And Queen is here because of the Canadian context, and I'll use that in reference to a particular example. But my American colleagues say, hey, we don't have a queen, but we got some humans. So essentially, the humans then say, okay, well, how are we going to manifest our obligations? Be consistent in our law and legislation with the directives of the creator, right? So they come up with constitutions and legislation and policy, and then get into management plan, all of these details, which are sort of hierarchical in their application. I'll talk about science in a moment. But then what happens on the Indigenous side? So this creator, this is my caveat, this is not a pan-Indigenous framework. This is an offering into ethical space that helps to describe or create understanding amongst non-Indigenous people about some of the concepts within Indigenous societies, and not all of them, again, based on my experience. And it's presented in a hierarchy because that's what facilitates the understanding, not necessarily because it's a hierarchy, but it does happen to fit. I've been getting good feedback from both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. So you have this creator, creates all the things. In the case of the Okanagan and others, but I'm really using the Okanagan as I mentioned, the creator delegates the authority to the actual earth, to the animals, to the plants, to the water, to determine the decisions that will impact themselves as well as humans. So the creator delegated the authority for the determination of the fate of their own relationships with each other, and also the fate of the relationships of the humans, the actual fate of the humans. So in the case of the Okanagan, the creator said, okay, you bitterroot, you Saskatoon berry, you blackberry, and you salmon, you get to decide not only how you interact with each other, but also you get to decide whether these humans that are coming will live or die, right? So the creator said, you guys decide. Luckily for the Okanagans, the animals, these 4 food chiefs, which they're called, got together and said, we'll let them live. We'll let these humans live. We'll give them our lives and our skins, and because they have no fur and fangs, they can't do much. So we'll give of ourselves so that they can live. So the essential question there is that the authority for the determination of the outcome of the fate of humans was delegated to the animals, to the actual earth itself, right? And so then what happened? Okay, well then stories are created. I mean, all of this is through the lens of the human interpretation, right? So it's all story-based. So then the stories tell about that, tell about the rules and the obligations that the earth entities had told the humans that they need to maintain in order to pay back for being allowed to live, essentially. Those stories contain protocols, rules, prescriptions, and people go and they go about living, right? And so what does this mean in terms of how we're interacting in our relationships between Indigenous and not, right? And so I'll start to get into some of the examples here. And I think I know I'm running about gonna
yeah, it's going to give you a 5-minute warning, but
yeah, so it's going to be squished real tight here. So but there's lots more, and I know if you guys want to talk, I'll make the offer now. Like, there's so much within this and some of the other concepts that we're thinking through. I'm happy to talk with anyone who wants to talk about them. So this direct lineage of authority from the God to Queen to these constitutional elements in Canada has really been exemplified by the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. So Canada came up with a constitutional 1982, a reform to the Constitution, which it said, Charter of Human Rights and Freedom says we should be good to each other, essentially. So the Canadian Parks Service came in and said, oh, we think we should use this agreement within our negotiations. We're doing an MOU to establish a national park. And we said, oh, that sounds good. How to be good to each other. We should take a look at it. The first line of that document says, we believe in the supremacy of God. Right. And so this whole societal structuring reinforces the belief and the authority of a God who delegated authority to human entities. Right. And it's like, oh, well, we can't really do that because our God did not delegate the authority to human entities. So right there, you have a fundamental difference. Right. And so we said, well, we can't incorporate the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms because it doesn't mesh with our view system. We're not going to agree to endorse a God who delegated authority to the human entity, right? So that's a fundamental thing. And I'm running out of time here, but I'll talk now about this concept of science, and we'll call this traditional ecological knowledge, right? All of that information contained about the ecological systems are told through the stories which reflect this authority of the animals and the relationships that they have with themselves. So both science and TEK can be viewed as observations of the natural earth, taking some data, doing some analysis, making some conclusions and developing recommendations, right? So that's kind of the process of earth observation. We all do it, and scientists do it really well. They're really into figuring things out, all that kind of stuff. So what comes out of that scientific document is basically this set of recommendations, an interpretation of what the earth has said, right? Call it an earth truth, if you will. And climate change is a wonderful example of this. Scientists have been saying for 30, 40 years, hey, the earth is telling us something, we better do something about it, right? But what happens to those recommendations? Right, when scientists are saying this, they go into this policy validation feedback loop, right? So none of that earth truth information being provided by science has any inherent authority unless it's been validated by policy. And what happens in policy? We all complain about all the time, like so-and-so got lobbied by such and such industry, there's no money, the organizational structure is not set up, there's other policies that are impediment, and we got to get policy integration and consistency. All of this kind of stuff compromises this information that's being provided by science, right? And the challenge when you're in communication with Indigenous people is that this set of authorities is inherently reinforced and validated by the acceptance of that hierarchical system of authority where science has no inherent authority, right? On the Indigenous side, however, the information that's coming from the earth as communicated through story directly influences the behavior of people within that society. So the information coming out of the earth itself has the highest level of legal authority because it binds people to it, right? So the laws that are being followed are the natural laws. So you hear Indigenous people talk about these notions of natural law, right? So one of the challenges that we're having today is that scientists get quite excited about this opportunity to learn more from Indigenous people, to say, oh, Indigenous people have been here for thousands of years and it's all wonderful information. We should gather that, utilize that, incorporate that, respect that in our scientific work. Some even going so far as to say we should change the nature of science, indigenize science. I don't agree with that. I think science is awesome. Like whatever gets your rocks off in terms of satisfying your innate human curiosity, it's wonderful. The challenge is, though, that the assumption that people are making is they're creating these equivalencies between science and traditional ecological knowledge, which on the face of it, may be equivalent, both in methodology and recommendations, but not in inherent legal authority, for actually being able to constrain the way that humans behave within the society. So when scientists say this, and managers say this, institute that I was working with, Institute for Watershed Governance out of Canada, wrote this wonderful report making recommendations to the government about what should be done about watershed planning. And throughout, they're like, we need more TEK. Wouldn't it be great if we knew more about how to be better? And of course, it's wonderful stuff, no malintention. But when they got to the end of the report, they said, we hope this plan will inform policy. So they wanted all of this highest level of the law. They equated it with science in sort of methodology and conclusion, but they wanted to subjugate it to a policy validation feedback loop, because that's the process. We hope this plan will inform policy. And so the question in reconciliation around these types of talks is, why would any Indigenous person, nation do that? Why would they subject their entire highest level of authority to a policy validation feedback loop outside their own system of governance, understanding, worldview? So this is the question in reconciliation, I think, that we're really struggling with. It's like, well, when we're talking about where we're trying to reconcile, understanding those levels of authority that are contained within the information we're receiving is really important. I know I'm running out of time, but part of that mechanism is really creating the equivalency in some of the legislative frameworks which are guiding our agreements, right? So in the case of the national park, it's like, well, National Parks Act says don't pick endangered species, and we are looking to coyote stories, coyote's ears or whatever, to say what story within the canon of the law, which is described in traditional story, creates the same or relatively equivalent point of behavioral guidance. And so in terms of creating equality and creating this legislative equity within these agreements, that's the exercise that we've been going through, I know. Now I'm totally running out of time, so I'm going to just go totally through the presentation, not to describe it, but to say, here's a taste of more stuff that is important to consider. So this has all been said. Historic legislation and policy exists out there. People are coming now. What should Indians, what do the Indians think? We want to know. Listen to the stuff that's been told for 150 years and be responsive to that policy guidance. You can have this presentation so you can review it. I just want to briefly talk about the shorthand that's associated in our daily lives with the deeply held assumption and validation of a perspective that delegates the authority for decision-making into the human entity. So in this instance, we have the sort of traditional planning or these theories of change, like, well, if we want to save the water, we're going to have to do this change, this change, this change, and then we'll save the water, right? Inherent throughout that process, which is all of the planning we're doing, the entire environmental assessment process is predicated on this assumption that we're making a decision. We have the authority as human entities to make a decision about should we or shouldn't we impact this particular system. So in this situation, it's like the human decisions predicate, or the human decisions influence or determine the outcome of the natural systems, right? So in the case, should we or shouldn't we pollute the water? Okay, well, the outcome of the system is determined by the human decision. On the Indigenous side, the system, because it has inherent authority, determines its own outcome. In the case of the Okanagan, water must be clean. So the human decisions are in line with the system outcome. So you have a complete inverse way of making decisions. So in terms of ethical space, it's not about the topic at hand. Should you or shouldn't you pick blueberries or log? It's really about that's why those conversations are so dissatisfying, because you're bringing to the conversation this inherent assumption that humans have the authority to make those decisions in the very first place. So starting off on that wrong foot, if you will. So there's more here. I know I'm running out. Yeah, let me just wrap there. We can have some conversations. I'll leave you with the, hopefully, I know this talk has been quick, but the questions are, well, if you understand where we're at in the system, what we're really thinking about, the inherent authority, like, do you understand the significance of traditional ecological knowledge as a legal instructive? Do you understand the system and the differences in the weighting of the inherent legal authority of earth-based information? And of course, these other things like the regular old capacity challenges and transparency and time. I really like this quote. Krishnamurti, I don't think, is an Indigenous person from North America, but Action has meaning only in relationship, and without understanding relationship, action on any level will only breed conflict. The understanding relationship is infinitely more important than the search for any plan of action. So he acknowledges here that you can't do anything without relationship. And I would argue that part of that understanding relationship is not the interpersonal relationship, but it's the understanding of the relationship Indigenous people have with their land. Getting back to the Truth and Reconciliation's conclusions about all of our work in reconciliation is about healing those relationships of Indigenous people to their land. Thank you, and I apologize for the quickness of this presentation and my speaking. I'll stop sharing.
Gwen, no apologies. You just have so much to share, and I hope folks take you up on possibly following up and discussion. And I may be having some more brainstorm reach out to you as well. So I do want to honor, we had a lot of questions, and I know you reviewed the questions we got during registration and tried to incorporate those into both what you shared as well as the PowerPoint. And we will be sharing that as you mentioned. Gwen will send that to us and we'll distribute it to everybody. We did have one question that it goes a little bit back into what you're talking about, but I think it's important to understanding framing. I think we all kind of get where the importance of sustainable economics, particularly for Indigenous communities in those discussions. But Samantha, feel free to jump in if you want to add anything. Samantha had a question about, she noticed that capitalism wasn't included in the Western written culture when you had the two paradigms for reconciliation. And do you have any thoughts on how that orientation, worldview, or economic system play out in some of this reconciliation work you've done?
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about that for sure, and I have another sort of schematic related to the corporate accountability in thinking through the application of this particular conceptual framework. But I think, capitalism is not, the exploration we would need to do is sort of run through the inherent authorities associated with the corporation and with this capitalist philosophy and determine how they're making those decisions. And I'm not an actual academic, and so I'm sure there's a lot of literature out there around the nature of capitalism in context of this. But I don't think that an economic system, whether it's capitalism or any kind of other economic system, is in opposition to any one of these particular worldviews, right? And I haven't thought enough about it particularly, but the question I have in relation to economics is how to sustain a world based on the economic opportunities we all enjoy, or not all of us, but many of our opportunities. And the United States is different, right? And I don't know much about the United States except to say the reliance on the individual is unique amongst social democracies or democratic first world countries, if you will, in that you have this reliance on the individual. And so I don't know, I haven't played a part all of those kinds of things, and that reliance on the individual translated into capitalism creates a unique set of circumstances, I think, in America, which are a little bit different. And I don't have too much to say other than, like in Canada and other European countries, if a single mother finds herself in need of help, she gets a lot of help. It's not about her, it's about her children, the opportunities. And I compare and contrast that with this notion of individualism within the States, which is the obligation of the individual to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. I think I've thought about the American situation and some of the challenges and compare and contrast those opportunities or those realities. So I think that's a much broader conversation, but I don't think capitalism itself is, I mean, there's a lot of challenges, but it's not necessarily related to where we get our inherent authority for the way we behave, and that inherent authority, the legal imperatives that are constraining our behaviors.
Thank you. And there was a a request to maybe hear some more of your presentation in the post-recording formatting. So we'll talk to Gwen about that. So thanks for that recommendation. One thought I had as you were going through, and I think this relates to some of the questions we got in registration. And if folks have questions, please raise your hand and put it in chat. But you were discussing the reconciliation framework, and you had this really great example of the community member who was able to access berry picking by walking through the neighborhood. And the question was, is that reconciliation? And, you know, kind of where that fits into the framework in terms of thinking through processes that are beneficial and meaningful and satisfying for Indigenous people. So one of the questions we had is kind of, and maybe you can touch on how you dealt with that in the situation, or if you have similar experiences of many of our facilitators on the line and many of the federal agencies. We're in this framework, we're at that management policy level in terms of that's where folks have the authority to kind of make change and have a discussion. And so if we're facilitating these conversations, whether they're government to government, more culturally appropriate safe space, or another kind of informal or formal interaction with tribal nations in the US, how can we rectify and center that process when we're already stuck in kind of this framework piece in this space that's at a management level versus from an Indigenous perspective, the storytelling or the protocols given by Earth? Hopefully that makes sense in terms of the
Yeah,
framework.
it totally does, because that's the question that, you know, we're attempting to answer all the time, both, you know, in the negotiations we're having, in the conversations, and how we're beginning to think through this concept of ethical space, right? So I have this thing that's called trajectory of awesomeness that flashed on the screen, but it's like, well, how do you prepare to have these conversations, right? And when everyone's wanting to go have bannock tea with Native people now and learn all this cool stuff and sort of get in touch and all this kind of stuff. But how do you prepare to have those conversations, right? And it's really critical for governments in particular to come to the table, if you will, armed with particular impediments described really in detail. So if you say, well, we can't do this, well, what specifically is blocking you from doing that? What other policy, what legislation, what behavioral or cultural, you know, what's it called, hidden bias operations are at play here, right? And acknowledging those kinds of things, but getting really specific, because Indigenous people need to know, okay, well, if that's your impediment, how do we go to work on that, right? And one of the challenges in sort of, you know, some of the policy work I'm doing, this conceptual framework for the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge and climate change, which is like everything, right? So you have to establish the government to government relationships. You go through on the issue topics. That's where the laws come out, right? It's like, well, we're not going to harvest deer in tick season, right? That's a law, right? It comes out in this topical negotiation called management planning typically, right? And so what the problem is now is that those management plans stay in management plans. And then they're like, oh, we hope this influences policy. So what the challenge, I think, in terms of those of us in Canada and British Columbia who are responsive to the legislative requirement to identify the changes needed in legislation to realize UNDRIP, is to come out of those policy or those management tables, those policy tables, to say, okay, well, we recognize, and I talked about recognizing the significance of the law. We're recognizing a law which is in an environment which is not its natural milieu, i.e. having any authority. So we have to have a mechanism back into the policy and legislative environment on the Western side or within this sort of ethical space, new space, which describes the opportunity and the process for making those legislative changes, right? Because right now everything just gets stuck in management planning and policy. Well, Indigenous people are saying, well, listen to us, these are laws. We can still have those conversations which result in good outcomes, say we want to do restoration or all that kind of stuff, but recognizing that the information in there, those are different levels of significance. And so you have to have the pathways back. And so that's one of the challenges in government, right? Once they commit to UNDRIP is doing that exercise. And so when you're in that, you're like, oh, we're doing management planning, recognizing those impediments and constantly advocating for the laws to be applied at the higher level. In Canada, there's a federal process, and we're saying, okay, well, in the national park negotiation, we're coming out with a set of laws, right? Okay, it's going to need a legislative change to establish the park in the National Park Act, right? Part of that legislative process, it's available, it's called an incorporation by reference, which you just reference another jurisdiction's law, used to be provincial law, but now within UNDRIP and the commitments to apply Indigenous law, we have the opportunity for the incorporation by reference of Indigenous law within the Canadian Constitution. Right, and the amendments. So we're pushing on that in terms of the negotiation. How do we do that? We haven't got any pushback. So that exploration process of creating that pathway into those specific changes is really important. And that's an interim step until we really sort of figure out what a truly reconciled, how do you reconcile God and creator? Like, how do you reconcile that authority? So these are transitionary appointments. But when you're in community, really important to drill down into those specifics. That's my recommendation. Don't just go, oh, we can't do that. Oh, we don't have budget. Oh, we don't have a department, all that kind of stuff, right? So.
Excellent, thank you. And if we don't get questions, I'm going to go through them. One thing that occurred to me, and I don't know if you've had a chance to think about this, is we are in a kind of system of intense polarization, political polarization, and kind of the areas where some of that systemic change can happen, and advocacy. And we know, in the US, tribes often advocate for government to government consultation, discussions with leadership to get to that kind of higher level of reconciliation and change. So there's like, what can we do on the ground in the management level, which thank you for touching on that. And then we have this sense of kind of getting to the legislative piece. But then there's also, both in that legislative piece, and I think in the spaces that we deal with in management, this concept of intense polarization. Like, we still encounter intensely polarized dialogue, intensely value-based, whether conscious or unconscious, decision making between the parties. And sometimes it's not just the tribes and the federal agency, it's multiple federal agencies, it's community stakeholders, it's state agencies, multiple. I was almost thinking like multi-eyed seeing when you were talking about two-eyed seeing. I'm thinking a spider, right? Like spider seeing. But do you have some thoughts on how reconciliation can help kind of break through those polarized positionings?
Yeah, and I mean, this is what Canada and maybe the Biden memo provides enough directive. But what Canada says, we're going to change our legislation to be consistent with Indigenous laws, essentially, right? That's the interpretation that Indigenous people are saying. And so the question of some people, well, how do we know when reconciliation is successful? You will find yourself in whole or in part following Indigenous law, right? Because then we've somehow been able to reconcile those highest level of the legal components. And the question about values and the conversation we have about values, to me, is a distraction. Right. So you come to the table, you're like, what are your values? We want to hear your values and all this kind of stuff. And you're like, oh, you value trees. Well, we don't. And then you have this discourse, right? That sort of, and again, that assumption about humans have the authority to even have those conversations about values related to those kinds of things, right? And so values is not the conversation I think we need to be having. Values are important, they guide us, but our values are based on the beliefs that we have, right? And those beliefs and those assumptions that we so embody through our acceptance of the system that we're in are so infrequently challenged. But for me, it's like, for the person who follows the law, we may or may not agree with that law, but we follow the law. We may or may not have values which are inconsistent with that law, but we follow the law. And so when the government says, okay, now we're going to have these conversations which open up this concept of legal pluralism, we're talking about laws, we're not even talking about values. And so those laws will result in the application or potential application of different sets of values on the landscape. But for me, it's not about values, because that is the conversation we've been having for so long. Come do your valued components for the EA. Come tell us about what you think about this, and right, and then we'll have this conversation about values. But the conversation is not about values, it's about law, right? And so it's a bit of a red herring, if you will, I suppose, in some ways, right? That's my perspective, my thinking at this time. So.
That's awesome. Well, I do want to honor that some people have to jump off. It is 10 o'clock. I know you're willing to follow up with folks with questions. We have tentatively set another COP. We were going to send the save the date for August 25th. I'm thinking, if you're available, that would be great, Gwen. But I invite everybody to join us August 25th, and we can kind of dig deeper into some of the dialogue that you started in framing this for us today on August 25th. National Center also has an intergovernmental relations in the NEPA process specifically scheduled for September 8th. And I just popped the link in the chat box. But if folks want to stay on, I know you have a little bit of time, but not much today, Gwen. But if folks want to stay on for last minute questions, please do so. Gwen is not going anywhere. We have her email address, Gwen Bridge Consulting, reach out, and we'll continue this dialogue, both in terms of the follow-up video and other items. And yes, I wish we had more time, 90 minutes. Well, next time we bring you in, Gwen, we'll just schedule more time. So I know folks had to leave, but any other quick questions or thoughts, anything to close out, Gwen, before people jump off?
Well, I always appreciate dialogue, and I feel like when I get into this, I talk too much. And so I appreciate you guys listening, and I'm always always wanting to learn too. And I think, if this is helpful in any way to your guys' work, that's awesome. And if you want to talk more about it, or these applications, constantly thinking about the refining the application in real projects in real time and real negotiations is the access. But this work is, like I said, I'm not an academic. This comes out of this concept of praxis, right? I've been doing this work for 20 years. These ideas come out and then we apply the ideas and we're constantly refining that, right? So, I'm a practitioner and a trainer by happenstance, right? So I'm a sharer of my information. So I'm constantly on that journey, and I learn from everybody who's participating in that. So yeah, happy to have conversations.
And just so everybody knows, I've already invited Gwen to join our community of practice sessions moving forward. Really helpful, Gwen. And I know there was a lot of different questions, and I'll work with you in terms of like, I feel like you covered a lot of the questions we got in registration, but if anybody feels like their question wasn't answered or they need more specifics, please feel free to email myself or Gwen. And we'd love to follow up with you on that, just to make sure folks feel like their questions were answered.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And sorry, I know that that concept has a name. It's called the dual authoritative hierarchical framework. So for those of you who want to reference it, because I couldn't think of a better name. I could we call it like ethical space sandwich or something?
I don't know if I like was it dual
authoritative hierarchical framework.
That is a mouthful.
I know, it's ridiculous.
That puts the National Center name to shame.
I know, so that'll stick in your memory maybe. Anyways.
Excellent. So I really appreciate how you provided some of that framework, and I'm actually gonna pull up. I want to take a closer look at the framework for awesomeness.
Yeah.
The trajectory of awesomeness.
Trajectory of awesomeness. Yeah.
So we'll pull that slide. We're getting, just so I know you're dealing with some screen issues, but we're getting a lot of really great feedback. Folks really enjoy the conversation. More time with you is what we're hearing over and over again. And we'll work with getting the presentation out to folks and maybe some additional follow-up overview of some of what the slides mean, so folks can review those as a reference. Any other pressing questions folks have? I've got some thumbs up. All right. Well, really appreciate everybody for joining us today. I think you have a negotiation today, Gwen, so I don't want to keep you too long. But again, let's keep the questions. Really appreciate helping think through the framework. And for those that are working predominantly in the federal space, we have talked to CEQ and others, and the guidance document, kind of that manageable policy area for Biden's guidance on Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge should be coming out in the fall. And so we're hoping to continue the dialogue and thinking through, like, where does this kind of bring us into a more ethical space, and where are there opportunities for us as facilitators to create that culturally safe space, those spaces for robust dialogue that are ethical spaces and allow for the reconciliation and that access to land that we're looking for. So really appreciate you helping us start thinking through that as we see how things evolve in our own systems.
Well, thank you all for being here. It's been great. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, I just want to do a clap out. We've got some emojis. Anybody want to just open the mic and have some quick thank yous or thoughts before we say good afternoon for the rest of the day? Got a lot of chat thank yous and a lot of claps.
Yeah, great.
Awesome. All right, so I'm going to stop the recording, but if folks want to just touch base for follow-up, please feel free to stay on.